Some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast, hosted by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders. After nearly 20 years exploring the world of conspiracy culture, we are taking our guests and listeners on a guided tour of the rabbit hole. Our mission? To discover where the truth lies.
On the 3rd of December 2025, Henry Nowak, an 18-year-old British university student, was murdered by Vikram Singh Digwa, a 23-year-old British Sikh in Southampton, England. Digwa stabbed Nowak 5 times, including a fatal wound to the chest with a 21-centimetre dagger. Nowak's funeral took place at Brentwood Cathedral on the 23rd of January 2026, and the following month there was a charity football match between the two university teams that he played for, held in his memory. Digwa went on trial on the 14th of May 2026 in Southampton Crown Court on charges of murder and carrying a knife in public. Digwa was carrying 2 ceremonial knives at the time of the murder. One was a small knife known as a kirpan, and another was a 21-centimetre dagger that he used to stab Nowak. The judge noted that in his sentencing remarks that Digwa was a member of the Nihang order of Sikhism, who have a tradition of carrying the second larger dagger in addition to the kirpan. But Gurnam Singh, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, said during the court case that the weapon was worn as a sign of membership of the order, but there was absolutely no good reason to wear the larger blade, as it is not a strict requirement of the faith. So Digwa had essentially made the decision to wear this larger blade. In court, when he was asked why he'd not told the police that he'd stabbed Nowak, Digwa said that he was scared because it was the first time anything like this had happened, and he alleged that Nowak had threatened him earlier with racist remarks and had begun recording him with his phone. In his account, after being taunted, he said that he grabbed Nowak's phone and a fight broke out, during which he claimed that Nowak was the aggressor and he said, "I'm going to kill you." Digwa said that he acted in self-defense, and then he further testified that his mother, who had arrived on the scene, had taken the knife back to their home. On the 27th of May, the jury retired to consider a verdict, and the day after, the 28th, it rejected all claims of self-defense and found Digwa guilty of murder and Kaur guilty of assisting an offender, that's his mother. Digwa was sentenced on the 1st of June, with Kaur to be sentenced on the 17th of July. The prosecution, led by Nicholas Lobenberg, told the jury that Nowak's blood alcohol level was below the drink drive limit and that he'd basically been walking home from the pub and filming things on Snapchat. Apparently, they bumped into each other, an altercation had taken place, and ultimately Nowak had been murdered. But the important thing was, although the footage was shown to the jury, Lodenberg said that the killing wasn't seen by anyone other than Henry and Vikram Digwa, and that after the stabbing, Digwa chose to aggressively pursue Nowak. So the first time that this starts to bubble up on the internet is on May the 20th, when Elon Musk decides to start posting about it. And the first thing that I saw was a sort of Russian doll of far-right influencers, a razzle stack if you are. End Wokeness, which is a terrible, terrible online Twitter account that riles people up and is very, very right-wing, tweeted out, "Zero stories by AP, PBS, New York Times, NPR, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Washington Post, Reuters, or MSNBC on Henry Nowak." And Elon Musk had retweeted this, saying, "This is so unjust." This had then been turned into a meme by Visegrad24, who is yet another right-wing influencer online. And then this had been shared by another right-wing influencer, Deep Blue Crypto, who had tweeted this out with the phrase, "I can't breathe." And another tweet saying, "I can't breathe" was the last words of Henry Nowak as he was handcuffed by the British police while heavily bleeding. Now, The reason that nobody was talking about it in the press is that under UK law, once a suspect has been charged, as Vikram Digwal was on the 8th of December 2025, there's strict legal restrictions under the Contempt of Court Act that come into effect. So basically, this actually bars the media from publishing anything that might prejudice the jury and affect the trial. And so this is any of the details of the case, body cam footage, 999 audio, or anything, any specific allegations, evidence that could influence people and ultimately upend the trial. On May the 21st, Deep Blue Crypto tweets out, the British police is complicit in his murder. British politicians are complicit in hiding it, and British media is complicit in not covering it. And there's a picture of Henry, and it says, I can't breathe, I've been stabbed. Henry Nowak was handcuffed for racism and he drowned in his own blood. Henry Nowak, 18, stabbed while police believed his attacker. Now, over the next few days, rumours about the case were swelling on the internet like a Wagner passage. And for some reason, the saddest man on the planet, Elon Musk, was at the centre of whipping up bad feeling about the case. And a week later, on May the 28th, this was when I first became aware of the case. Now, you may have seen this, Brent. Elon Musk claimed that he was going to do something slightly strange. This was reported in the Daily Echo. He essentially claimed that he was going to sue Hampshire Police. Now, Hampshire Police is the police department that dealt with the case. And yeah, so for some reason, he's trying to essentially inject himself into the conversation. This was reported on by the Daily Echo. The tech billionaire's comments, which came during the jury trial at Southampton Crown Court, were directed at Hampshire Constabulary after the 18-year-old Henry Nowak was arrested and handcuffed on Belmont Road in Portswood before dying of stab wounds on December the 3rd, 2025. Vikram Digwar, 23, of St Den's Road, had been found guilty of murdering Mr Nowak at Southampton Crown Court. The Echo had not been able to report on these posts before now because doing so could have prejudiced the jury trial. So they weren't even allowed to report on Elon Musk talking about it because that itself could have been prejudicial. Mr. Musk commented on the then ongoing trial by sharing a series of posts starting on May the 20th on his social media platform X. His post was in reaction to another by Tommy Robinson, who himself was reacting to a post about Mr. Nowak's last words, that he had been stabbed and that he couldn't breathe. Musk posted, unconscionable. I am happy to fund a wrongful death lawsuit against these disgusting excuses for law enforcement. They damn well better have been fired. Now, during the trial, the court was shown body cam footage of a fatally wounded Mr. Nowak telling the police that he'd been stabbed and that he couldn't breathe. But the police handcuffed Mr. Nowak, acting on Digwar's claim that he was the victim of a racial attack. He repeated those claims in his evidence at court in what was labelled a wicked lie by the prosecutor Nicholas Lobenberg. In another post, Elon Musk said, this poor boy was running away from someone who stabbed him and stole his phone, but the police in the UK attacked him instead of his murderer. Mr. Musk also criticised Prime Minister Keir Starmer for not commenting on the case and supported calls for the police to release the body cam footage so that the public could see it. And he responded, true, to a post saying that the refusal to release this body cam footage was in effect an admission of guilt on the part of Hampshire Constabulary. Now, that's fairly inflammatory, saying that the police attacked Henry Nowak, but this is the sort of thing that Elon Musk does. The reason that the body cam footage had not been released at that point was because it was being, it had to be viewed and approved by the family, because obviously this is, something, a very, very horrible thing, and for them to have to see it again or run the risk of having to see it again, obviously the decision is theirs. And so that is why the body cam had not been released. Well, I mean, at this point as well, the trial was still ongoing. So when Elon Musk was tweeting these things. So where they got this information from is not entirely clear. On the same day, as reported in The Independent, the police actually apologized for their conduct during the incident. The police forces apologized after officers handcuffed a fatally injured man despite him telling them that he'd been stabbed. The court was told officers from Hampshire Constabulary had handcuffed him after Digwa had told him that he'd been a victim of a racist attack by Mr. Nowak. The officers took the action to arrest and handcuff Mr. Nowak, despite him telling him that he'd been stabbed, and it was only when he collapsed and lost consciousness that officers started to provide first aid. Following the case, Temporary Deputy Chief Constable Robert France has apologised on behalf of the officers, but said that they were lied to and would have been unaware of Mr. Nowak's injury, which he said would not have been obvious. He said, "This is an absolutely tragic case, and my sympathies are absolutely with Henry's family, his friends, and his loved ones. I want to apologise. I want to say that I'm sorry that Henry couldn't be saved that night. I'm sorry that he was handcuffed and arrested in the moments before he lost consciousness. It's quite clear that officers didn't understand what had happened immediately, and that is some of the context I would ask people to understand. There had been a delay from those who chose to eventually to call him. There were lies from Henry's killers in the 999 phone call, and further lies from his killers as officers arrived on scene. Despite Henry telling officers he had been stabbed, it took them some minutes to realise what had really happened. Within 3 minutes of that engagement with Henry, they were giving him first aid, and they had taken the handcuffs off and were performing CPR. We referred ourselves immediately to the Independent Office of Police Conduct the following day, and they've been independently investigating ever since, and we're absolutely committed to acting on their findings." So that's interesting, that basically the police immediately sort of sent the footage and to the Independent Office of Police Conduct to investigate themselves to see if anything has gone wrong. You can look at that one way or the other. One, that they want to be transparent, or two, that they pretty much know that they've messed up in a way, so they want to sort of get ahead of it. But he continued, "It's clear to me that the circumstances were complex. For example, Henry's significant wound, the wound that was fatal, was deep and internal. The pathologist was clear in court that it would have been hard to find, and that the bleeding was inside Henry's body. Sadly, there was nothing the officers could have done that night to save him." And this is something that we'll come up later, is that there was a lack of blood on the scene because the blood was essentially inside. But this doesn't satisfy the right wing. Visegrad24 has a post reposted by Elon Musk. "I can't breathe" were the last words of Henry Nowak as he was handcuffed by British police while heavily bleeding. And then someone called C3 is also reposted by Elon. "Release the Henry Nowak police body camera footage so people can see what real systematic racism looks like. They let an innocent kid bleed out over it. Anything less is unacceptable." And so already we can see several things. It doesn't really line up with the facts as we know them. Who knows what will happen when the body cam footage comes out. But for some reason, people are already trying to claim that this is about race, and not only that that the case itself was about race, but that it highlights systemic racism against white people. And they're saying that essentially Hampshire police force and essentially the entire government is kind of racist against white people. And it's like, it's interesting because it's like Hampshire police force is about 90% white, and Hampshire itself is about 90% white. So in order for that to indicate anti-white racism is would be strange, but this is what people seem to be trying to say. Interestingly, at this point, there've been two very high-profile killings recently, or one attempted killing, and one in which a Saudi Arabian man was stabbed to death for doing absolutely nothing, and another in which a neo-Nazi had attempted to behead a Kurdish man after becoming radicalized online. These were both in England, both happened very recently. Strangely, Elon Musk has not been bothered to talk about any of these, or neither has anyone else in the right wing. But for whatever reason, they felt that this was the case that they needed to talk about. Tommy Robinson injects himself into it, saying, "So Hampshire police laughed as Henry Nowak was dying. They took his and his dad's phone to search for racism in a sickening attempt to justify his murder." And essentially, basically, there's some phone conversation here, which is explaining what had gone off. It took Henry's phone and his dad's, checked back through every single message to see if there'd been a racist comment or joke. Yes, thank goodness, just the police to deal with now, as they thought Henry was a racist and laughed at him when he told them that he'd been stabbed. They were also told by a neighbour, but believed Digwa. They have apologised, but I think there will be more to come. Elon Musk reposts somebody called Adam Guizarda, don't know. More and more details are leaking from the ongoing process. The killer, Vikram Digwa, called the police instead of an ambulance and lied that it was Henry who attacked him, that he was drunk, insulted him with racist remarks, and knocked off his turban. Hampshire police arrived, 3 female officers, and immediately handcuffed Henry, even though he was lying in a pool of blood with stab wounds to his chest and legs. He repeatedly said, "I've been stabbed. I can't breathe," on the body camera footage. An officer's voice is heard saying, "I don't think you have, mate." The officer who handcuffed Henry laughed when he said that he'd been stabbed. Then they dragged him across the gravel and kept him restrained as he bled out. Only when he lost consciousness did the officers remove the handcuffs and begin resuscitation. Henry died at the scene. Moreover, the police took Henry's phone and his dad's and read all the messages looking for racist comments or jokes. Now Hampshire police has issued a public apology. "We apologise that Henry was handcuffed and arrested at the moment he was losing consciousness. We were lied to by the perpetrator. Despite this, neither the court nor the police have yet released the camera footage. An IOPC investigation is ongoing. Many are calling for the dismissal of the officers who were at the scene. The 3 female officers reportedly left the force." Okay, there's several things that are wrong with this already, like spoilers, because we are revealing this as it was revealed to the public, but it wasn't 3 female officers. There was a male on there, and just like, the casual misogyny there as well. That's just again indicative of certain ideals. On May the 29th, Elon Musk retweets again the end wokeness 0 stories from various news outlets. And he writes himself, "Both men said, 'I can't breathe,' but only one man's death was covered. The only conclusion that can be drawn is that the legacy mainstream media is incredibly hateful and racist against whites." I think we all know what he's talking about there. He's talking about George Floyd. And again, this doesn't work on for a number of reasons. One, they were both talked about because they were big incidents that resulted in court cases. This is being talked about now because the court case is over. But it's we'll come on to why it's different as well in a bit. Because as I say, at the minute, details are very sketchy and people don't know what's going on. Robert Jenrick of Reform decides to get involved, and he confirms that Reform would ban all Kirpan knives following the murder of the university student. And Kirpans are these ceremonial knives that Sikhs carry. This was not actually the knife that was used, but it's still a knife. Now, normally they're short and they're blunt and they are ceremonial, but Reform, basically because they have a lack of policies and are essentially just a grievance policy, an outrage machine that is designed to essentially make friends of Nigel Farage rich, decided that despite not having any policies of their own that could help people, this was a bandwagon that they could jump on. Robert Kendrick has confirmed that Reform UK would ban the carrying of ceremonial blades like the Sikh Kirpan, which was held alongside another knife by murderer Vikram Digwa. Speaking to GB News, the Reform economic spokesman said his party would end the existing legal protections that allow blades to be carried as part of a cultural practice. GB News national reporter Charlie Peters said, "In Wembley Stadium, I certainly couldn't sign up with a razor should I want to have a shave at half time. But Sikhs are allowed to go into the stadium with a 5-inch blade. Do you think that the law should change now to get rid of that differing appreciation of who can carry a blade and a dagger?" Well, first, it's worth saying that in this case, the killer was actually carrying 2 blades, of course. One was a shorter ceremonial dagger. The other was a much longer blade, Mr. Jenrick said. But the actual blade that was used to kill Henry was a 21 centimeter blade, which may not have been eligible for the limited exception that is under the law for religious swords and daggers. But to answer your question directly, I do think the law should change. Is there a place on our streets for swords and daggers? No. And should people be treated differently depending on their faith? No. So reform would change that law? Yes. Yes, it would. It's something that our Home Office Affairs spokesperson, Zia Youssef, will immediately look into. We believe in equality before the law. We should all be treated equally. And that means that you and I should be treated exactly the same as somebody who is Sikh, a Hindu, or a Muslim. You should not be having a dangerous weapon out on the street under this limited exemption under the law. Now that obviously reforms quest to treat everybody equally will end if you're not in that particular category, if you're an asylum seeker, if you're a refugee, even if you're an illegal migrant. But there's points to be scored on the internet and on the telly, so generics out there doing it. So again, we can already see that people are using this for their own agenda. We don't really know the details, other than there's been a tragic death, and it's being used to suggest that there's a light touch regards crimes against minorities and an unfair overzealous of white people by law enforcement and by society in general. And they're trying to say that this is a consequence of woke acceptance of difference. And before this all ends, it will be about immigration. Trust me on that one. Now, the irony of this is that Digwa, the gentleman who murdered Henry Nowak, was born in the UK, as was his father. Henry Nowak was the son of Polish migrants. And it wasn't so long ago that Poles were considered the number one enemy of people like Tommy Robinson, particularly during the time of Brexit, because they were seen to be coming over here and taking our jobs and then taking their money back to Poland. This is obviously not true, but at the time it suited people's purposes. On May the 30th, Zia Youssef tweets out, and he's I forget exactly his position. He's at the top of the shit tree that is the Reform Party. He tweets out, "Where's the Henry Nowak body cam footage? Release it now." And the following day, May the 31st, it is reported by the BBC that Sikhs are being demonized after the Southampton murder. And this comes from Sikh community leaders. A leading figure in the UK Sikh Federation has told the BBC that the community has been demonized after a university student was killed by a Sikh man using a religious knife. Early this week, Vikram Digwa was found guilty of murdering Henry Nowak after stabbing the Southampton University student with a ceremonial blade that Sikhs are required by their faith to carry. Dabinderjit Singh claimed that the Sikh community has seen a huge increase in hate crimes since the trial. Following Digwa's conviction, prominent right-wing figures, including the world's richest man, Elon Musk, have criticised current UK law around carrying the knife. Given the political environment, the rhetoric has made Sikhs really think why they are being targeted, said Singh. Because this could happen to any community. An individual could break the law and murder someone, but you wouldn't demonise that entire community. This is not about the Sikh community and its religion. It's about one individual, and trying to get that across to the current political environment has proved really difficult. Section 139 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988 states that it shall be a defence for a person charged with having an article with a blade or point in public to prove that they had the article with them for religious reasons. And this legislation also applies to anyone wearing it as part of a national dress. So the blade that's worn as part of Scottish Highland dress, you know, that they have a small blade, is it in the sock or whatever? Weirdly, no one's bothered about that one. No one seems to be bringing that up, you know, but essentially it's the same thing. But for some reason, people don't bring it up. Now, the second that this is used as an offensive weapon, it becomes an offensive weapon. But essentially, again, the thing is, it wasn't the Kirpan that was used. And as far as I'm aware, there's been very little. It's not a commonality that Kirpans are used. In fact, The Sikh Federation has said in a statement, fully practicing Sikhs who wear a kirpan should continue to recognise the serious responsibility that accompanies it, together with the limited legal protection that exists for wearing it for genuine religious purposes. The Federation said that it believed that the large blade that was used by Digwell was not the normal kirpan worn by fully practicing Sikhs. But again, like this is the strange thing. It's like they've chosen to focus on that already. People are suggesting that the murder is somehow indicative of Sikhs or Sikh culture or foreigners or immigrants or non-whites. And there's two ways that you can immediately prove this is utter bullshit. So one, they didn't do this again with the recent Nazis that have killed people. They didn't go, we need to demonize the whole thing. Or they didn't demonize the white race because of that. Or what they always fail to recognize is that the main common denominator in this is men. Why don't they demonize men? You know, particularly like, you know, in regards to domestic violence and things like that. You know, for some reason, certain people on the far right don't want to look at those particular stats. Elon Musk retweets Hampshire police saying, "Release the footage, you evil bastards," which is obviously helpful. Hampshire police have tweeted out, "Our officers were misled at the scene, including denial of weapon use. They quickly switched to life-saving aid within minutes. But as laid out in our statement, the medical evidence shows that the injuries were not survivable. A very sad case. Our thoughts are with his family." And what's interesting is they've got a community note there that says, "Claims that Hampshire police misled, including the denial of weapon use, is misleading because Henry had stated, 'I've been stabbed, I can't breathe.' An officer replied, 'I don't think so, mate,' before cuffing him as he bled out. The victim's words were dismissed. There's been no suspensions and the body cam still withheld. Release the footage." Now that's interesting because that is not the normal sort of community note that you get. That's been heavily personalized and normalized. And I wonder who wrote that. Elon. Anyway, so we're on to June the 1st, and it's been reported that the Vikram Digwa has received a life sentence. A UK court on Monday jailed a British Sikh man for life for killing a university student in a case that sparked anger after police handcuffed the dying victim following a false claim of racial abuse. A judge at Southampton Crown Court sentenced Vikram Digwa, a 23-year-old local resident, to life in prison with an obligation to spend at least 21 years in jail for the killing of an 18-year-old student, Henry Nowak, on December the 3rd. A jury on Friday found Digwa guilty of murdering the accountancy and finance student on the street last December. The trial was seized on by prominent figures such as far-right activist Tommy Robinson and SpaceX founder Elon Musk, who claimed it showed police bias. Officers arrested and handcuffed Nowak at the scene after Digwa claimed that he'd been racially abused. The victim died from stab wounds soon after. The judge said that he was sure that Henry had said nothing racist. So if you remember that Digwa had tried to claim that he'd been racially abused, and there was film footage of this because they'd both been filming each other on their phones prior to their altercation. And the judge has obviously seen this. And he says that Henry had not said anything racist. So claims of this were completely false. And Henry's family had made a statement outside court. They said that the way that Henry was treated by the police was inhumane and degrading. And speaking outside the court, his father, Mark, said that the contrast between how his son and how Digwa had been treated was unbearable, and that Henry did not die with dignity. Following Digwa's sentencing, Nowak's father, Mark, called for a full, fearless and transparent investigation into the police response. But he also urged people not to use his son's death to create division. In a statement outside court, Nowak's father, Mark Nowak, said, "We want to use Henry's heartbreaking story to make change for the better. We do not want his death to be used to create further division, hatred, or tension. We want his story to help make our streets safer for everyone." He added, as the KC for the prosecution summed up in court, "This is not a case about Sikhism. This is not a case about racism. this is a case about murder. So that seems fairly clear, the family's intentions. And so what actually happened? Because it's still not entirely clear what happened. So on the evening of the 3rd of December 2025, sometime before 11:30, Henry Nowak was walking in the area of Belmont Road in the Portswood suburb of Southampton. He was walking home after a night out, and he'd been to the pub, but he wasn't drunk. He was under the drink drive limit. The judge said in his sentencing remark, Henry was not drunk, but may have been affected a little by the small amount of alcohol he'd consumed over the previous few hours. He was not a regular drinker and did not generally drink to excess. His blood alcohol level at the time of death was below the legal limit for driving. So what's happened is Nowak's been recording himself and various things on Snapchat. This was recovered. I think the phone was actually stolen by Digwa and was recovered later. But he's walking along saying things like, hello, car, and singing to himself. And so he's just, a student on the way home from the pub. And then he sees Vikram. He sees Vikram Digwa, and he sees that Vikram's got a great big knife on him. Not the kirpan, the other knife. And it's apparently, it's clear to be seen. And so for some strange reason, Nowak decides to start teasing Vikram Digwa, saying, what, are you a bad man? In it, bad man? What, bad man? Say that you're a bad man. Go on, tell me that you're a bad man. And Digwa was still walking away in the video, apparently, before turning around and saying, I am a bad man. The judge's remarks. In Belmont Road, you and Henry passed each other. You claimed he deliberately barged into you. I'm sure that was one of the many lies that you've told and repeated since it happened. However, there was an interaction between you both. Henry, perhaps cheekily, made a comment asking if you were a bad man. He was filming you on his phone when he said it. The tone of his voice was not aggressive or threatening. As it turned out, it was a tragic error of judgment. It is a reasonable conclusion that the comment was because he had seen the large dagger. That would have been a very unusual thing for an 18-year-old student and non-Sikh to see. You moved towards him and confidently told him that, yes, you are a bad man. This was the response, I believe, of someone who thought they were being disrespected. And this was made worse by the perceived intrusion of discovering that you were being filmed. You were not frightened or concerned, and you grabbed Henry's phone, removing it from him. The exact events which immediately followed were only witnessed by Henry and you. However, it would not be unreasonable to conclude that Henry would have wanted his phone back, believing it had been stolen from him, or that he'd been robbed. That may have led to a physical struggle between you and him. It would also seem that your turban may have been knocked, pulled, or potentially punched off of your head. The wearing of the turban at all times is another fundamental religious requirement of being a male Sikh. The removal of it by another would have been considered a serious act and a further mark of disrespect. It is a reasonable conclusion that this would only have added to your anger. Now, just to understand, the judge is in no way blaming Henry for it. He's just saying that could have also flared up your temper. You've felt that you've been insulted and disrespected. You've seen that you've been filmed. You've then got into a tussle and you've been potentially punched and had your turban knocked off. So another slight against you. And that, again, is called rage. You drew the dagger from its sheath, and as the jury was sure, you deliberately stabbed Henry in the chest. The knife passed through several layers of clothing, as demonstrated by the multiple slits in the dark top where the material had been overlaid on itself in the struggle, and the single slit in his shirt. It passed upwards through the soft tissue between the two uppermost ribs, catching a lung and cutting an important vein behind the collarbone. This was to a depth of 8 centimeters from the skin. The consequent bleeding flowed into his chest cavity. The pathologist, Amanda Jeffrey, found 2 pints of blood there. She said that no emergency medical treatment would have permitted access to the bleeding vein. In simple terms, he would not have survived, however quickly he received first aid, CPR, or any expert medical treatment. You also stabbed him twice to the upper leg at some point, and once again to the lower abdomen and the groin at the front. So the judge explained that the footage filmed by Digwa showed Nowak desperately trying to get away by scaling a fence and getting onto a communal bin before falling and landing on the car of the next door neighbours. So what's happened is they've gone into this fight. Digwa's taken Nowak's phone. He stabbed him. And then for some reason, he seems to have been teasing him and filming him. And he's tried to get away, and he's tried to get away over a fence, and he's either fell or been dragged back down. This is the judge speaking. Digwa continued to make films of Henry's suffering, ignoring much of his desperation at having been stabbed. The judge added, Digwa called his parents, who arrived before the police. Kiran Kaur, his mother, took Digwa's knife and hid it in their home. So the mother knew what had happened. The judge continues, you continue to make films of Henry's suffering, ignoring much of his desperation at having been stabbed. You told him that it had not happened, no doubt to convince others who were nearby. Your attitude did not change, even though Henry was clearly going downhill very fast. Your brother did much the same, although he may just have been accepting that which you had told him rather than lying himself. You lied to him that you'd been attacked, picking up on his question about whether it had been accompanied by racism, by falsely claiming that Henry had called you a peace slur. I'm sure that Henry said nothing racist. You are the only person to make that claim, and it is completely at odds with Henry's previous character. You join your brother in relating these lies to the police. By then, your mother and father were at the scene. Gurpreet, that's the brother, explained that no weapons had been involved or were present. In fact, whilst he was talking to the call operator, you told your mother to take the murder weapon, sheath and belt, away, which she did. You did not tell your father what had really happened. At approximately 11:30, less than half an hour after Nowak was seen on CCTV heading home, the killer's brother, Gurpreet Digwa, called 999. He told the operator that Vikram had been attacked by someone racially and gave their location. He's physically attacked my brother. We're Sikhs. We wear turbans, and he's just attacked my brother. And this is what he said on the call, which lasted about 12 minutes in total. And the call said a man physically attacked his brother. He said that no weapons had been involved. The caller says that Henry is being restrained as he attacks his brother and took his turban off. And because I've actually listened to the call, Gurpreet says that he was verbally and then physically attacked, and that his brother tried to film all this. But he says that Henry looks drunk and that he's fallen over the fence and he's hurt his face, and so he's bleeding out of his mouth. They say that Henry stumbled into him drunk and started an altercation by asking if he was a bad man. And Digwa says that Henry attacked him first and called him a peace slur. When asked if Henry is injured, Gurpreet says that he's hurt his face falling as he tried to climb over wheelie bins and a fence to escape. Gurpreet checks on Henry and tells the 999 responder that he's hurt his face and is bleeding from his mouth. And there's an interesting point, is that at this point, there's Vikram's father, Vikram's mother, his brother Gurpreet and him, and also a neighbour that's there. And it appears that the only two people that know that he's been stabbed, other than Henry himself, is Vikram and Vikram's mother. It seems very likely at the time that Gurpreet and the father were not aware that that he'd been stabbed. Body cam footage shows 4 people on the driveway whilst Nowak is on the floor. That's the mother, brother, Digwa, and a neighbour. The footage shows Digwa lying to the police by telling him he'd been racially abused by Nowak. When Hampshire police officers arrived, they spoke to Digwa whilst Nowak, fatally stabbed, lay on the ground. Digwa told the officers that Nowak was drunk and had punched him and used a racial slur against him, pulled off his turban, and he also showed what he said was a swollen eye and a bruised face. 1 minute and 11 seconds into the footage, Nowak is saying that he's been stabbed. He said, "I can't breathe," 7 times. And this point, okay, this is the thing that, again, it's still not been released here. The footage has still not been released. This is still the judge talking about it. At 23:38, Nowak is handcuffed. An officer is heard saying Nowak is under arrest and read him his rights. And 1 minute later, an ambulance is called and officers administer CPR. The judge said that Nowak's injuries were so severe that he would not have survived, however quickly he received first aid. At 11:55, Vikram Digwa was arrested at the scene, but he was arrested for a fray because it appears that they'd been fighting. And there's some controversy because it appears that for some reason he was not handcuffed, because it would appear that they still thought that potentially he was the victim of an attack. When he arrived at the police station, and once the reality of the stabbing was clear and the police realized that Digwa's story was a lie, he was rearrested for murder. But initially he was led away without handcuffs, which is another indignity because essentially Henry Nowak was handcuffed. And at 12:30 that night, a warrant was arranged for Digwa's home, and the murder weapon, which had been hidden by his mother, was recovered. And his mother has also basically spent 7 months on remand and is currently awaiting sentencing. The judge carries on. You carried on telling these wicked lies, and the police attended on scene, hampering them in doing their job and effectively obstructing the course of justice. You kept Henry's phone with the incriminating recording of you on it. You had no intention of handing it over. It was found on you after you'd been arrested and taken into police custody. So they found Henry's phone on him when they searched him at the police station. Another consequence of those lies is that the attending police officers honestly believed that there were reasonable grounds for suspecting Henry had committed an offence and arrested him, with the consequence he was handcuffed for about a minute before his condition further deteriorated and the arresting officer began CPR. The police were given a convincing but wholly false narrative of the incident. It was dark, and Henry was wearing a dark top. The entry damage caused by the knife through it would not have been obvious. Whilst there was visible blood on Henry, it would not have clearly been seen coming from the wound, and the clearly visible facial wound was not life-threatening. Henry was complaining that he'd been stabbed and he was struggling to breathe, but that would not have necessarily told the officers how serious the situation had become. It is the experience of the criminal courts that sometimes someone arrested and handcuffed will feign injury in the hope that they may be released. The police officers were faced with having to make a very quick decision in pressurized circumstances about the best way to act. The genuine shock to the particular police officer when he realized that he'd been giving CPR to Henry when he had a serious chest wound tends to show that he was doing his best in a very difficult situation. You were still present at the scene when Henry was saying he was dying, and still you did not tell the truth about how seriously you knew you had hurt him and the need for urgency. Instead, you said that he'd not been stabbed and that he was exaggerating. And so that's interesting because the judge certainly appears to be saying there, or mitigating the response of the police, basically saying that they did make errors, but they made errors because of a series of events. They'd been told what to expect. It was dark. There was no blood coming from the chest wound. The chest wound was high up on his chest and hidden by dark clothing. And they assumed that he was drunk. So that's the judge saying that. Now, furthermore, Digwa and his brother conspired to lie about the events because basically Vikram Digwa, after being arrested and held, he was given the opportunity to speak to his brother Gurpreet in the back of a police van 2 days later, on the 5th of December. And the conversation basically occurred whilst the brothers were being transported together to court. And so what the police did was they secretly recorded this. And this was lawfully done. They placed recording equipment in the back of the van. And speaking of Punjabi, which I believe they probably thought would be a barrier to being discovered, basically Vikram completely dropped his false claims of racial abuse. He confessed directly to his brother that he'd stabbed Nowak. He said 3 times, including once to the chest. And basically, he said that the whole racist thing was just concocted. He realized that it would no longer work now that Nowak had died. And so the brothers discussed in the back of the van the best strategy to go for. And they decided to change their story to say that he'd basically been attacked and acted in self-defense. Now, unfortunately, the audio from this was obviously recorded, and this was devastating, absolutely devastating evidence for the prosecution, because it proved that Digweed had basically lied, and lied several times, and also had the opportunity to sort of do something about this, and hadn't. So a lot of people were saying online, why hasn't Gurpreet, the brother, been charged for perverting the course of justice or obstruction, for basically suggesting that he lied? They might still, they have the opportunity to bring that charge against him, and apparently they are currently reviewing this. But spoilers, he's pretty watertight on some other charges, which we'll talk about later, and it looks like he's going to get a serious custodial sentence on these other charges. An additional charge might complicate this, and there's a slim argument as well that you can claim that you're suggesting a legal strategy rather than lying, or that he misunderstood and he still believed that he'd been attacked. So the defense would say, I wasn't saying that you that you should lie. I was saying that's the best defense tactic. It's crap, obviously, but it's one of those things where it can sway it. So they might still is the best answer to that. Now, you've got to remember at this point, nobody outside the court has seen this body cam footage. Okay, this is the judge talking about the body cam, and the judge seems to be saying that basically that there's errors were made, but there's reasons that these errors were made. I'm not sure I agree with that, but we'll come on to that. But Nigel Farage decides to stick his oar in because, Nigel Farage has been having a bad time. He's not really been able to appear that much in public because people keep asking him pesky questions about this £5 million that he was given by this crypto millionaire prior to standing as leader of Reform, and various other financial improprieties that some people suggest look like bribes. But anyway, he tweets out, "Our institutions don't care about Henry Nowak because he's white. I do, and he deserves justice. Release the body cam footage." And that's just fucking despicable. That's the other reason that Nigel Farage has gone totally gloves off with this as well, is because he's noticed other people being racist online, trying to push this as an instigating to a broader conversation about race and how all these foreigners are dangerous and essentially should be deported and immigration should be stopped. And it's not about race so much as it's about culture, Neil. And these people, they bring these terrible cultures to these problems. It's like, well, that's just a way of being racist without using the word race. But anyway, and the other thing is that basically Nigel Farage is, because the Reform Party wants to win wider votes, they've had to tone down some of their overt racism. They were for sort of mass immigration. They basically then said, actually, we think some immigrants are pretty cool. And so this basically fell into the hands of Restore, which is an even more right-wing party headed by Rupert Lowe, who used to be in Reform until he fell out with Nigel Farage for calling him the Messiah. Anyway, that's another story. And so they're basically, they're in a rivalry to see who can be the most overtly right wing, to appeal to that percentage of that demographic of voters, essentially. And also because, again, this all is about whipping up feeling and trying to anger people and trying to incite people, essentially. So the body cam footage is released, and it's absolutely tragic. It's horrible. It's just the whole thing is just horrible. So the police arrive there, and you can see Digweed's father trying to hold Henry up. It's sort of leaning up against the front of the house, and Digweed's father says he keeps dropping from side to side, so I'm trying to keep him up. He's got a mouthful of blood, and I don't want him to choke. And he's slurring. Henry's slurring, and he sounds like he's got a mouthful of something, like, or that he's sort of, smashed his mouth up or something. And he says, "I can't breathe." And at this point, Digvar says he's jumped over those fences and stuff like that. And the father says, I think he's obviously fallen and he slipped from there and hit his face. And Digvar says his other shoe is over there, pointing to the other side of the fence. So the police ask Henry's name and he's unresponsive. And he does seem drunk. And the 999 call did say that he was drunk. And so they've arrived and gone, oh, this is the drunk that has racially attacked him and then fell over and hit his face, which is exactly what the 999 call said. Obviously he isn't. The tragedy is that he's dying. The policeman asks if anyone else has been hurt, and Digvar says that he was attacked and he had his turban knocked off and his hair pulled, and he claims to have a bruise to his eye. Henry then groans and says, I've been stabbed. And his top is somewhat pulled up, so you can see his stomach and you can see his lower back. And there's no visible signs of blood. However, that's twice he's claimed this now. So the policeman says, let's get you out of there. And he tries to move Henry, tries to pick him up. And Henry says, I've been stabbed. I've been stabbed. And another policeman holds up his right arm and they attempt to get him to stand up. And he says again that he's been stabbed. So how many times has he said that now? And the first policeman says, what's happened to you? And Henry says again, I've been stabbed. And at this point, this is when they really should have checked Henry more thoroughly. They had an opportunity to establish the truth, and this was missed, because at this point they only looked at Henry and not checked him for his injuries. Now, yes, people lie, as the judge said, but they did have this chance, or several chances, to establish the facts, and they missed it. Okay, so what's happening here is that two opposing stories are being told, and the police have believed the wrong one. But they should have tested both stories. But it appears that essentially the police have turned up with, say, 90% of the story in his head, and so basically look to confirm those details rather than consider any other possibilities. Now, you can understand why, okay? Particularly when it's dark, particularly with the nature of the thing, you could say that it's a perfect storm. However, the police have to be held to a higher standard than that, because that mistake could have cost someone their lives. Now, sadly, in this case, it wouldn't have happened, but if they'd have checked when he'd said it all those times, just a cursory check would have given them the opportunity to do something about it. And it's just a failure on the part of the police. Now, you have to make these judgment calls all the time when you're police. And sometimes people get it wrong. But again, when the police get stuff wrong, they have to be held to a higher account than normal people. So this was something where I was talking to a friend about this, and basically, like, they says, well, there's your problem. You see, they've turned up and they've believed something. They shouldn't believe anything. They should check it's true. And I was like, oh, hang on, like, explain that to me like I'm stupid, because you've got 4 or 5 people telling the one story and one person telling them the other story. Are you telling me that they shouldn't have believed the 4 people, but they should have believed the one person? And it's like, no, they shouldn't have believed anybody. They should have checked. And again, at this point, there was an opportunity to check these claims, to make sure that their response was correct. And so the argument is that this is indicative of having an attitude of knowing what's happened before establishing the facts, which is not how you should go into these situations. And that's the thing. Like, when Henry says that he was stabbed, should you have believed him? No. Just like you shouldn't have believed the family, but you should have checked to make sure. And that's the distinction. That's the error that the police have made in this. And again, you could say, well, all the facts seem to line up with what they were told. You could understand why they made that judgment call, but they made the wrong judgment call. They absolutely made the wrong judgment call. And as police, you really shouldn't. So this is the thing, that the police have really, really made an error there. So the policeman says again, you've been stabbed. Whereabouts? And he isn't responsive. He might even say in his face, but which has obviously got a wound to it. And then the policeman says, I don't think you have, mate. Now, this has been framed by a lot of people as him mocking Henry or laughing at him. And that's not it. He's just being genuine. He does not think that he's been stabbed. He should have checked. And the only argument for the police not checking was essentially there was a lack of blood. And what you could even make the argument that Digwar's father, who's been there holding this guy, it's not been apparent to him that he's been stabbed. But again, the job of the police is to establish the facts rather than to just accept a story. And they didn't. And so it led to a very, very undignified position for Henry. And so at this point, he's cuffed behind his back and he says, I can't breathe at least 3 times. And in the background, Digwar can be heard saying, racist. Henry says, I can't breathe twice more. And they still haven't checked him at this point. And so the first policeman says he's been stabbed. And the policewoman asks Henry where he's been stabbed. And Henry says, in the face. And it transpired that he had actually been stabbed in the face. And the Digwar then starts shouting over and says he hasn't been stabbed. And the policewoman, and this is another error, turns round and says, yes, I know, but we have to check. Then why haven't you checked? Again, the assumption, yes, I know, has proven to be gravely incorrect. I don't think it's malicious on the part of the police. I think it's laziness and it's incompetence, and you could even say a degree of arrogance of coming to a position where they didn't know. And there should have been at least a senior officer that made sure that the facts were established sooner. Henry says, please, brother. And the police tell him that they're going to keep him lying down on his side. And they're starting to get details from the crowd around them. And the policeman asks his name, and then he formally arrests him. And Henry does look in a really bad way. And the policeman says he's going to be sick, I think. And again, to me, that indicates that the policeman is not trying to be callous. He genuinely thinks that he's drunk, and that's why he's going to be sick. But again, it is your job to establish those facts, and those facts were wrong. And he shouldn't have ignored the repeated, I've been stabbed, I can't breathe. Then began to notice that he's not responding. And so they do call an ambulance saying, we've got this guy who's been beaten up. And then one of the female police officers notices that his pupils are not reacting. And at that point, the footage stops. And it's horrific. It's absolutely tragic. It's obvious that they've made an error. And it's obvious that they've been deceived by Digwar. But it's also nothing to do with race. They're treating Henry as a drunken suspect that has attacked somebody. They would have responded in the same way. They've responded because they believe the story over the phone and are responding as if that is 100% accurate. They would have responded the same way if Henry's crime had been that they'd found him trying to break into their shed, or if he'd been spraying graffiti on their walls, or anything like that. The police's actions were not determined by the fact that the charge was a racist attack. It was simply because Digwar's statement that Henry was the perpetrator, and they arrived on scene, and that's what they were dealing with. It's not a race issue. But that doesn't stop people like Nigel Farage tweeting out, this is the most shocking footage of discrimination that you will ever see. A white boy being handcuffed by police officers, more concerned by an accusation of racism than an act of murder. This must be a turning point. White lives matter too. But it's not discrimination. It just isn't. There's a strong argument that it's incompetence, laziness, a lackadaisical attitude to establishing the facts. But it's not about race or discrimination. It's about the police's response. Father Calvin Robinson, obviously, he decides to get in on the act. And this is retweeted by smart person Leilani Dowding. Believe every victim. In Britain, the alleged crime of racism is worse than grievous bodily harm and eventual murder. The police believed the perp when he yelled racism, but ignored the victim when he said that he'd been stabbed. Henry is a victim of DEI. But that's not what's happened. They've responded to a call saying a drunk man had attacked Digwa. They arrive and they see someone being propped up against a wall who seems drunk, and the people who called them to give him an explanation stood there saying, this is the drunk man that attacked our son. It's clearly an error, but it's nothing to do with racism or anti-white sentiment. It's about responding to a call and a man lying to try and get away with murder. Just because Digwa said racism, that didn't dictate the response. They would have acted the same way if they'd found Henry in possession of a weapon or something like that. Like, people say all sorts of things to the police to try and get them off the hook. And that's ironically, that's what Digwa did. So someone saying that they've been stabbed and lying, or saying that they've been injured, or that they've got a broken arm so you can't cuff them or something like that, it's not uncommon. But again, they really should have checked the facts. And again, they've assumed that the wrong person's lying, but they've assumed that the wrong person's lying, not because of the weight of the argument or because that they're concerned about social issues, but because there's 5 people telling them one thing and nobody telling them another thing until they actually arrive on site. And again, it's bad police work. It's called colouring the narrative. Having a presupposed idea about what's happening, even if you think that you're responding to a fairly straightforward call, allows for things like that to happen. Should they have asked why he had blood in his mouth? Yes. Should they have checked him more thoroughly? Yes. It's a horrible, horrible mistake. But again, it's not to do with race, I don't think. I don't think there's anything to indicate that it is. And for people to try and use it for that is just despicable, really. I mean, it's cheap. But that's what people do. This is what this series is about. In the culture wars, the vultures start circling immediately and give this false pretense of giving a shit about somebody or being concerned about something, and then but just hype it up to create this false narrative of a world that just simply doesn't exist by spreading lies. Again, so that the police have failed to acknowledge to establish the facts, but the far right seem determined to not acknowledge the facts and to just use it for their own purposes. And they also lie. Like Robert Jenrick, Henry Nowak's murderer will be out of prison in just over 20 years. Why did he not get longer? Because the judge ruled that as a Sikh, he had a good legal reason to carry a 21-centimetre Shastar knife on the streets of Southampton. This sentence is a joke. This is two-tiered justice at its worst. I will not let this lie. And again, it perfectly sounds like it. If Jenrick's telling the truth, then what? Because it's a religious article, that's lessened your sentence. That doesn't sound right. It's because it's not right, Brent. It's not true. This was tweeted out as an explanation by Nazir Afzal, who's a lawyer. Vikram Digwar received the mandatory life for murdering Henry Nowak. The judge set a minimum term of 20 years and 190 days, a 15-year starting point and aggravation to 23, minus mitigation and time served. That is the earliest parole eligibility, not his release. So Jenrick lied. The judge noted that it was possible that he initially had a good legal reason, which was religious, to carry the large dagger, but explicitly stated any such reason ended once drawn. Abusing the Sikh privilege to carry it publicly was listed as a key aggravating factor that increased increased the minimum term. No discount was given for the faith or the knife. Jenrick omitted the aggravating part and the minimum term reality that the sentence was not lighter due to religion. So Jenrick said he got a short term and it was lessened because of the knife. He lied about the term and the sentence was actually increased because of the knife. So if he's talking about two-tier, and like it's the opposite of what he's saying, oh, two-tier justice, he was let off because of the religion. No, he was punished more because of the responsibility that we spoke about earlier of having a knife like that in public if you're going to use it for religious reasons. Nazir Afzal tweeted out, no, he won't be out in just over 20 years. That's the minimum term before he could apply for parole. And no, he didn't get a lighter sentence because of the knife. He's deliberately cut out the bit that it says he got a longer sentence. If he was still a solicitor, he'd get struck off. Robert Jenrick is used for a solicitor. So he knew that he was lying. He knew that he was lying about all of those things. That's just absolutely shameful. On June the 2nd, Nigel Farage, early in the morning, decides to tweet out that he will deliver an emergency address to the nation at 8 a.m. And this is breathtaking arrogance, but, you know, there's a tragedy and he's going to use it. He's absolutely going to use this poor boy's corpse as a soapbox. And it's just pathetic. This is the speech that you may have heard of, Brent. This is the speech in which Nigel Farage decides that the best thing to do is to call for pure cold rage.
Yeah, I've heard this term being thrown around on X.
Some would say, some would say that was, some would say that was irresponsible. Some also might say that was inciting to violence. But who can say? So Nigel Farage said, good morning. It's a moment to take a long, hard look at ourselves as a country and what we've become. The murder of an 18-year-old student, Henry Nowak, was bad enough of itself, but compounded in the most extraordinary way by the behaviour of the police officers. Many of us have asked for the footage to be released, and finally, last night it was. Let me show you just 30 seconds of what happened on that fateful evening in Southampton. And he shows the bit where he says, I don't think you have, mate. Just think of it. An 18-year-old lad, a student, been out with some friends for the evening, on the way home, and a victim of a sustained attack. Stabbed several times, chased down the street, stabbed seriously 5 times. And what happens? Well, the assailant's brother rings the police to say we've been racially attacked and abused by a white guy. The sirens blare. They arrive. Young Henry must have thought that at last help was at hand, but far from it. The police act from the beginning to the end, and the end when he dies lying on a pavement having been stabbed in handcuffs. The last thing he heard on this earth was him being read his rights by the police. He was actually treated in a way that meant an accusation of racial slur was treated more seriously than an act of murder. That's utter bollocks. That is not an accurate representation of what happened. That implies that they knew he'd been stabbed and didn't care. Like, they didn't know. Okay, they made a huge error, but that is exploiting a child's death. Farage continues. What does he say? I can't breathe. Familiar words. Remember career criminal George Floyd, who died in appalling circumstances in Midwest America a few years ago? Why do you mention the criminal bit? What has that got to do with anything? If it's later discovered that Henry was selling drugs to make ends meet at university, would that make his death any less tragic? Would that mean that he deserved it in some way? Because that's kind of what you're implying. Well, it's not kind of, that's exactly what you're implying. And the only reason that you're implying that is because he's black. Remember the reaction, the way that the police behaved? Within a few days, Keir Starmer was taking the knee. Black Lives Matter exploded all over the country. Churchill's statue was defaced. The cenotaph was vandalized. And yet, what has the public reaction been from our leaders and politicians, and indeed, to be frank, much of the media to this? Silence. absolute silence. Right, let's go backwards. No, there's not been absolute silence. There really absolutely hasn't. If you want to talk about things being defaced and vandalized, what about the Farage riots in Southport that you riled up with lies about immigrants murdering people? What about the subsequent violence that's going to happen after this speech? Don't give a shit about that. And the reason that people were so upset about George Floyd was because he was murdered by a policeman. He was murdered by a policeman, the institution that is supposed to look after you. The police didn't murder Henry Nowak. They didn't believe him and they treated him incorrectly, but they didn't kill him. And again, there wasn't silence. There was an ongoing court case. If people cannot see the difference between the police murdering somebody like in the street, and that's just, they're fooling themselves. It's a lie. I don't believe that. You can see the difference. You just want to use this as grist for your own particularly unpleasant mill.
And the person who murdered him stood right there.
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
The police.
Not the police. No,
and now is in prison for it.
He's been imprisoned for it. Yeah, rightly so. So, like, it's horrible. It's one of these things you're not going to be able to bring him back. But they're going to start saying, like, where's the justice? What more justice would you like?
It's gone through the justice system. It got absolutely. The maximum. It's if we want something different to happen in the legal system, then that's a different conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because I'm sure these people would like the death penalty or something like that. But
well, I think that people start to call for the death penalty, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, again, the most shameful thing about this is basically Farage taking an opportunity to do two things: one, rile up racist people and basically suggest that white people are under attack, which is laughable, and two, basically, it's a handy distraction from him lying about being hacked by the Russians. Who he claimed exposed the fact that he received a £5 million gift from a crypto billionaire, which initially he said was for security, and then he said it was for a gift, which some might call a bribe, for getting Brexit done. But regardless, he didn't declare it. Also, he may very well have bought a house with that undeclared money, which might be an illegal bribe. And also that he was using his business to allegedly launder personal money and avoid certain taxes. It's transparent, shameful bollocks. Like, this is Farage carrying on. Proof, if ever there was, that we're living in a two-tier culture in this country where the rights and privileges of white people matter far less than those of ethnic minorities. And that's absolute fucking twaddle. You're far more likely to be arrested, stopped, searched, to die in police custody if you are not white. Also, in institutions such as the police, non-white police officers have a much harder time and are actually scrutinized in their job far harder. This idea that institutionalized racism is not a thing is ridiculous. Like the gaslighting that is going on here, you're doing the institutional racist thing. All black people, all foreigners, all immigrants, all people of a certain religion fall under one category, and then you're telling us that there's no racism or that the systematic racism is against white people. It beggars belief. But people don't need facts, they need emotions in order to justify their own feelings of wanting someone to be inferior, which makes them feel superior. There's something wrong with my life, but it's not me. It's someone else. It's comforting to blame other people. This is the outrage machine that people like Farage live on. They're basically just there to make people angry. And it works on several levels. Again, you get a dopamine hit when you're angry. They're encouraging people. They're getting people addicted to be angry about certain topics because ultimately it will benefit them. Farage continues, now what has happened over the last few decades is without anyone being asked, without anyone ever voting for it, we've been subjected to mass immigration on a scale that is truly unbelievable. The fuck has this got to do with immigration? I told you. What did I tell you? What did I say? Right? This is nothing to do with immigration, right? And the idea that if you're not white, then immediately that indicates that you're not English, you're not British. Like, as we said before, Digwa was English. Digwa's father was English. Nowak's parents are immigrants. And it wasn't so long that Farage hated the Poles and the Romanians and people like that because they were coming over here and exploiting this country. But that is all memory hold. He continues, at least 10 million new people have come to Britain in the last 20 years. And let's be clear, many of them are great people who work hard and have integrated and made their lives here. But far too many have come have refused to integrate and are leading parallel lives and leaving many of our cities almost culturally unrecognizable from what they've always been. And this, again, is obviously a very favored tactic of the far right by saying it's the culture. It's not the fact that this area has got a lot of people of colour in it. That's not even crossed my mind. It's what they're doing. Okay. And 9 times out of 10 years, what are they doing? Well, they're fucking existing, aren't they? And I'm not having that. That's essentially what they're saying. But again, they have to couch it in this because it's pathetic. They don't even have the courage of their own convictions. But to stop any criticism of this, we've brought in hate speech laws. No, that's to stop discrimination, right? Well, I mean, and again, I'd raise this one. What is it, Nigel Farage, that you want to say that you don't feel that you can? What is it? It's the N-word, isn't it? It's just that. That's literally it, isn't it? This is what all this free speech stuff is about. Okay, is that people want to be able to do despicable shit without feeling bad for doing despicable shit because people have called you out for it. And all this bollocks that are going to, we've been driven to this, Neil. You don't understand. Okay. The more you call me racist, the more I'm going to react by being racist. And that's not my fault. That's it's like anti-racism. It's the fact that we were so not racist that has forced us to be racist. And it's like, well, the argument against that stupidity is, do you think racism is bad? If you don't, you're a racist. If you do, why are you doing racism? There is no excuse. There's no coercion. There's no attitude of society that has forced your hand. There's no anti-white bias. There's nothing of the sort. There's you being fearful of other people and deciding to try and justify this in some semblance of an academic way because you're a coward on every level. Anyway, Nigel Farage continues, we brought in a DEI agenda, and we really haven't. We really absolutely haven't. Rich white males are still very much in control and not in any way threatened. He continues, we brought in what is called positive discrimination in favour of ethnic minorities over these white people whose families have lived in Britain in many cases for centuries. Fucking hell. Did you catch that? Over those white people whose families have lived in Britain and in many cases for centuries. That's not even a dog whistle. That's an over appeal to white nationalists. And again, that's because they're leaving reform for restore because their rhetoric is more overt. And no, there isn't positive discrimination. Can you give us an example of it? No, they never can. Apart from some stupid thing where basically like, oh, they're trying to increase the number of black policemen, which obviously means that that's a white guy's job that's been taken. It's like, it doesn't work like that. It really doesn't work like that. Like, it's just bullshit. The idea with DEI that basically, like, you've still got to qualify for the job. DEI as well, again, DEI is mostly about women. We live in a phallocentric fucking patriarchy where rich white men get everything. DEI is basically so that all it really is don't be an arsehole. Don't be an arsehole. Don't discriminate against somebody because of what they are, right? Because of whether they're the color of their skin or their gender or their sex or who they like to go to bed with. Don't discriminate against people because of those things. Don't be a dickhead. If you can, it's fucking embarrassing that people need a framework to tell people not to be a dickhead. And yet here we fucking are, basically. It continues. That is the mess that we've gotten into, and it's why in some ways what's happened, and despite the appalling behaviour of those police officers, but in some ways what happened on the night in Southampton perhaps shouldn't be a surprise in two-tier Britain. Alison Pearson, journalist on the Daily Telegraph, received yesterday an email from an experienced, long-serving Hampshire police officer in which he makes it perfectly clear that the police are told that they must respond to situations in different ways according to the ethnicity of those involved in the crime or potential crime. I'll bet what it actually says is, just be aware that people might be different and have different experiences of the world to you. I'll bet it's that. I be aware that people have different beliefs and traditions and act in a certain way, and because of that they view the world slightly different to you and might have a different experience of the world to you. Like in the same way that you would speak to a pensioner slightly differently than you would speak to a teenager. That is what it'll be about. It's not about prioritizing people or treating someone as like intrinsically wrong or intrinsically exalted above the rest. And again, if you're really trying to express that in modern day Britain, that basically like, oh, the whites really get it hard and all the ethnic minorities, they're just like, we treat them so well, so very well. No, just absolutely not. Also, Alison Pearson receiving this like anonymous thing. Piss off. I don't believe it. He also describes how a DEI agenda has gone so far through the police that the people now get promoted not on the basis of merit, not on the basis of ability, but on the basis of what their racial or religious origin is. And that's led to a decline in policing standards. Nigel Farage really said that people get like, oh, we've got to get a Sikh in as a sergeant. Do you know how difficult it is to get promoted in the police? It's dead man's shoes, right? There certainly is none of that. This is utter bullshit. Like, I'll tell you what has led to dropping standards: continued budget cuts. This nonsense about, oh, they want to defund the police. They're like, yes, we want to defund the police. Do you understand what that fucking means? What that means is that the police don't go out and deal with sort of mental health problems and things like that, but we actually pay people who are qualified in that to do that, which would leave the police open to do police work. Like, that's the thing that's causing problems, not DEI. The fact that they're so stretched, and 9 times out of 10 they're responding to calls where they're having to treat people like they're essentially babysitting. They're going out to people who are getting into drunken arguments and stuff like that, and people who are having mental health crises and stuff like that, which could be better served by qualified people. But Farage isn't interested in that. But think of this, much as we may condemn the 2 police officers involved there, think of this. The biggest fear a police officer now has going about his duty on the street is the fear of being reported for having acted in a way that was racially biased. I don't believe that. I honestly don't believe that. And like, if you look at we'll come on to it, but like there have been certain reports about the police, like the police, it still has problems with institutional racism and sexism. And if they are worried about being racially biased, like, you should. What he's saying there, he's twisting it. It's like, you're worried about being pulled up for being racist. He's not the same as what he's trying to express. The fear, now greater than dealing with a dying man lying on the ground, Henry's family have responded to this in the most extraordinarily dignified way. But I suggest that the rest of us respond to this with pure cold rage. We will come back to this, but this is a massively irresponsible incitement to violence. Also, if you want to like track it completely, what he's suggesting is that the rest of us act not dignified, is what he said there. Also against the wishes of the family. Like, and he's got form for this. The Farage riots, the Southport riots. It's almost like he likes to stir up violence because it distracts from his lack of any plans or possible achievements as a politician. It riles up his base. He goes on, this is wrong. All the values and standards of living in a free country where everybody is judged equally before the law have been trashed and thrown away. And at this point, we would like to bring up the opportunity for you to Google Nigel Farage's nephew and how somehow he got away with taking photos of ladies' skirts. or Richard Tice and his avoidance of tax, or Nigel Farage and this mysterious £5 million bung that he appears to have got. There are one or two things that need to happen very quickly. The first is that the police complaints operation, the IOPC, needs to get to the bottom of this and produce a report very, very quickly. Secondly, even though the sentence given was actually lower than the recommended minimum for a sustained aggressive murderous assault. So, Judge William Mousley did actually reject the 25-year starting point and instead used the lower 15-year baseline, explaining his reasons via several factors. One, there is a degree of religious exemption. Digwell wore the blade under the legal privilege extended to the Sikh faith. The judge ruled that he didn't leave the house intending to commit a crime. So that might sound, hang on, you've just said that he didn't get off for religious. No, you've misunderstood. If he took out a knife with him as basically a violence thing and then caused violence, then that would have aggravated it. He had the knife because of his religious reasons. Once it was used, it becomes an offensive weapon, and there's still obviously a crime. But he didn't take it out like a lad in a tracksuit might take it out in the hope that he bumps into his ops. The judge factored in 10 aggravating features, including Digwell's wicked lie to the police that delayed medical aid, and raised the term from 15 to 23 years. However, they then dropped it back to 21 years to account for mitigating factors such as his young age and his previous lack of criminal convictions. That's simply just how the sentencing works. So he didn't actually get preferential treatment. I'll be writing today to the Attorney General asking him to review the sentence, but the most important thing that has to change if our society is not to be ripped apart, where communities start to distrust each other and deeply distrust the police and all other institutions of this country, is we need a change in culture. Enough of the anti-white prejudice, a promotion of the idea that white lives matter just as much as black lives. No one has ever said that. No one's ever said that white lives don't matter as much as black lives, but by making these statements, you're essentially knowingly undermining the real purpose of Black Lives Matter, which is the systematic, institutionalized racism that people of color still have to put up with to this day, right? And to pretend that you don't understand that is embarrassing, weaselly, weak shit. Cosplaying as victims. It's transparent and it's shameful. As we've said this before, it's like, oh, how come you can have gay rights and you can have the black rights, but you can't have white rights or white power? And it's like, well, because gay rights and black rights and things like that about culture usually, and about asking to be included or accepted alongside, whereas white power is usually about genetics and it's about feeling and being superior. And you know that, so fuck you. An end to DEI and positive discrimination, but a country that treats everybody equally and fairly before the law. This is serious, this is urgent. I fear for where our society will be in a few short years if we don't grip this and if we don't do it very, very quickly. I want to send my sincerest condolences and the country's sincerest condolences to Henry's family. I hope that this is the last time a British police force operates in this way. But the fish rots from the head down. It's up to the government and police chiefs to change this culture and to start that process today. Thank you. Henry's family specifically asked for stuff like that to happen. And again, this was about deception. This was not about unconscious bias. This was not about race. It was not about culture. It was not about immigration. It was not about two-tier policing. It was not about any of those things. It was a horrible crime, and then in the aftermath, police made a very, very grave error, but not because of race, simply because of the way that they approached the scene. And for Nigel Farage to basically hijack this tragedy and try and use it to get political cachet off of it and for his own purposes is shameful, is absolutely shameful. But that's what Nigel Farage does.